Welcome to the third lecture with the title of Deep Space. And of course, there are few things which are as immediately pleasurable for human beings as spaces, seeing them, moving through, experiencing them. You know, the pleasure of kicking a ball via the bilaterally axially organized soccer field, therefore immediately changing the patterns on this space, or the pleasure of walking through the sensorial richness of a forest with its many viewpoints, vistas, its smells and textures, or walking through a city with its many views, layers of history, layers of materials, sounds and smells. So it's of course a bit sacrilegious almost to talk about space in a matter of an hour and a half. But nevertheless, I would like to do it and focusing more on an almost mathematical property of space in order to continue our story of interactions, transactions, and relations in the service of connectedness. I want to show you emergence in space. We have seen this image already around 10,000 before now, where in Göbekli Tepe we argue the first time settlements started and the first time, of course, these tight interactions became possible, which over time led to the emergence of the tools and narratives, the infrastructures and institutions which allow us to have our complex urban lives, which changed from the very early forms of urbanization to increasingly technologically adept forms with larger reach, more energy, more power, and therefore more congestions at its nodes. And of course, again, what we are experiencing right now, the digital connectivities which allow us even tighter integrations, in the end, of course, ending up in this globalized world we have today, or this planetary urbanization which we enjoy, but at the same time, of course, are also victim of. So we looked at this arrow in time, and now I want to cut, so to speak, perpendicularly to this arrow and look at space. And when you look at space, again, of course, it is in the service of this interaction, transaction, relation, and it's in the service of stabilizing it. And over time, this stable form of space became increasingly complex. It became sped up by industrialization, enabled by virtualization, and therefore completely global, also with digitalization. You know, human beings are embodied minds. We are bipedal, we have two legs, we have a front and a back, and over 3 billion of years we evolved to exist on this planet with its gravity, its terrain, its sunlight, its up and down, right and left, backward and forward. And this means that we behave in spaces in predictable ways, also because as embodied minds, it takes energy to move around spaces. It is tiring to walk long distances. It is dangerous to turn sharp corners, and it also takes energy because your path of inertia needs to be changed into a new vector. And all of that together basically leads us to behave in predictable ways. This is what you see on the left-hand side in terms of this so-called visual integration pattern. It basically means a mathematical prediction on where you will have most people based on the fact that we tend to follow sightlines and we tend to avoid turning sharp corners. And when you look at the actual behavior of people, which is the right-hand image, also here in the Tate Britain, following 100 people in reality, then you see that these actual moving patterns very much follow the prediction which we generated mathematically on the left-hand side. So you see in the axis we have most people and spaces which are connected in more ways than just one on the left-hand side and are more easily accessible by straight sight lines and by not too many turns. Those spaces tend to be frequented more. On the left, the mathematical prediction, on the right hand, actual reality. What's behind this is a theory, a method, and even a software called Space Syntax, developed by Bill Hillier. And Space Syntax basically encompasses a series of theories and techniques for the analysis of spatial configurations. And the general idea behind it is that spaces can be broken down into components. They can be analyzed as networks of choices, then represented as maps and graphs that describe the relative connectivity and integration of those spaces. And the important thing, again, is we are embodied minds. We have bodies. We exist in the gravity well of the planet. Here we have to deal with gravity, inertia, and friction when moving through these spaces, and it is tiring to walk long distances, and it is scary to turn sharp corners. And basically saying we are not computers, right? For us, space is not equal, and spaces need to be traversed. And that basically leads us to the possibility of structuring these spaces and the fact that we tend to behave in predictable way in structured spaces, again, because we are embodied beings. Now, when you look at cities, cities are immersive realities. They're incredibly rich in terms of their sensorial stimuli. And we also learned to decode these spaces in cultural ways. We can read them, read them literally, so gap, reading gap, or on the right, or Oxford Circus on the bus. But we also read them implicitly. We know how to cross, we know how to move, we know on the right-hand side, behind the gap, there's an alley in which we can go. We see that because of the volumes being occluding each other slightly, but still clearly indicating an opening. We also see that along this road, which is Oxford Street, of course, it is very easy to move. And we know that in the future, when we walk along this axis, more choices will come to us. Now, on this road, we see a lot of people, and we also see a lot of stores and a lot of activity. The assumption now could be that there are a lot of people because there are a lot of stores. It's a shopping street, so of course there are people because there is a lot of things to be bought and to be seen. And yet, when we look at a similar graph or map as we have seen before, specifically at this one, then we see here again an analysis, a mathematical analysis of London, organized in these red lines, green, yellow, and blue lines. And what these lines now represent is basically, again, a calculation of integration. Meaning, we see here in red streets which run over long distances through the street grid of London. And we see in blue streets which are only tiny segments which are connected only once or twice to other streets. Or saying it differently, the red street segments are street segments which are linked in many more ways to the overall street topology in London than the blue street segments. And what we know from experience, and therefore the red lines are much more integrated into the street topology of London than the blue lines. And what we know from experience is that the red lines are those which give us access to the larger scale. They give us access to the street network in better ways than the blue lines. And usually on the red lines we tend to have commercial activity and frequency because there is footfall. And on the blue street segments we tend to have housing, which is intimate, private, and more protected. And a well-made city, by the way, is a city where we have blue and red close together, well organized, so that you have moments of privacy and intimacy, but with a couple of steps, you are in areas in the city which give you activity, commercial opportunities, and choices. So, therefore, what space syntax tries to explain to us, on the one hand, by a mathematical analysis, and on the other hand, by verifying this mathematical analysis with empirical tools, so counting people or following people. It shows us basically that it is not that there are people because there are shops, but rather there are shops because there are people. And the people are here based on the geometric and topological characteristics of the space. They are here because these long axial lines in the topology of roads in London, for example Oxford streets, are better integrated into the street network than the blue lines. And if we now again project time into this, then we can argue that patterns, so street patterns, street connections, frequency, so the probability of having people or footfall, and use, so for example stores, are co-developing. They are emerging together. And we see that specifically medieval cities are organized in a way where I have country roads coming together. Where they are meeting, I have a marketplace. Around the marketplace, I have local streets. And that then gives me these red lines and blue lines in close proximity. So the three most popular ways of analyzing this street network developed by Bill Hillier is basically integration, choice, and depth distance. Integration basically measures how many turns have to be made from a street segment. So a street segment means any portion of the street from one node to the next node, from one intersection to the next intersection. So how many turns have to be made from a street segment to reach all other street segments in the network using the shortest path. The street segments that require the fewest turns to reach all other streets are called most integrated and are usually represented with hotter colors such as red or yellow. Then the next thing is called the choice measure, which is easiest to understand as a water flow in the street network. So the streets with the highest total values of accumulated flow are said to have the highest choice values. You experience this, by the way, when you walk in cities you do not know. And in well-organized cities, all of a sudden you tend to end up in the marketplace, simply due to the probability of you making choices which bring you closer and closer to the core of the centrality of the city. And finally, we have the depth distance, which explains the linear distance from the center point of each street segment to the center points of all other segments. The streets with the lowest depth distance values are said to be nearest to all the other streets. Now, this sounds all extremely complicated, but again, I think when you think about your life in cities, you know exactly what this means, you know it intuitively. And it is the achievement of Bill Hillier on the top left, respectively, as a much older person. He passed away about a year ago, in the bottom middle, that he formalized these intuitive feelings we have, specifically with his book, which is now around 20 years old, Space is the Machine, and more importantly with his software depth map and his company and theory called Space Syntax. Anna Rose, the person to the left of him, is a close friend of ours, and we work with them quite a lot. And in this book, the Space is the Machine, he formalized these kinds of things in different chapters, so arguing for a need for an analytic theory of architecture. He described cities as movement economies. And he also described in chapter 5 why in the end he actually did this whole thing. He actually started his inquiry when looking at modernist housing developments in the UK, realizing that for some reason the public spaces in these housing developments did not work, they did not function. A lot of spaces felt scary, unprotected, and were hotspots for criminal activities. And he argued that these spaces were simply badly made from a geometric topological point of view. And with space syntax again, then he took this first intuition and turned it into a method and a mathematical way of organizing space. And his argument then in the end is again, space is the machine. What he means with that is spaces are functioning almost like fusion reactors. Spaces allow us to generate density of interactions, and with this density we can generate what we call urbanity, with both its social, cultural, as well as its commercial, economic connotations. And you could argue that natural movement is a kind of inertia theory. Again, what I said before, gravity, inertia, and friction. When people move, then their distribution in a spatial configuration will follow certain mathematical and morphological laws, given only that movement is from all parts to all others and follows some principle of economy in route selection. And again, the principle of economy is in fact that we are embodied minds who get tired over time when walking long distances, and we try to avoid to turn scary corners which we cannot look into. This also means that in difference to a city like London, which grew over many centuries and where this co-emergence of space patterns, of footfall, so frequency and uses, was able to co-develop in a way which feels natural, right? There were many, many iterations of footpaths leading to the road system which we see today. Here, Brasilia was, of course, a modernist development which was developed a lot more top-down, where the spaces follow the conception of an architect and urbanist. They do not follow this naturally emerging, co-developing space pattern which we have seen in London. And that means very much that the system is not so badly organized. So you see that there's a red axis in the middle and a cross axis which kind of function. But you also see that there is a total lack of polycentricity. There is also a total lack of density in the center, because the density then tends to look like this. So the density basically is that the center basically is a representational axis which has no interaction density associated with it other than these traffic points. So the top-down planning does not always conform to what makes a good city. What we need to take from it is that buildings and built spaces are probabilistic space machines able to absorb as well as generate social information through their configuration. Right? They make successful or not so successful urban patterns, which leads to successful or not so successful social and economic spaces. The building, so not only the city, but even the building itself, is much more than a stage set or a background. In itself, it transmits through its spatial and physical form key aspects of the form of the social setup. And that, of course, is the secret both of well-made architecture and well-thought-out urban spaces, that they enhance a well-structured social space rather than work against it. Looking at it a bit more precisely, you can also say that space syntax rests on three basic conceptions of space. So the axial space, which we already have seen, right, the straight sideline and possible paths, which is basically kind of describing the road system of a city. In addition to that, you also have the idea of the isovist, which I will explain in a second, which has been popularized by Michael Benedict at the University of Texas, actually incidentally a former professor of mine, also called a viewshed or visibility polygon, which describes the field of view from any particular point, and again describes scary or not scary, interesting or boring spaces. And finally, we have the convex space, popularized by John Peponis and his collaborators at Georgia Tech, which is an occupiable void where, if imagined as a wireframe diagram, no line between two of its points goes outside its perimeter. All points within the polygon are visible to all other points within the polygon, or a description of squares, right? What Gamillo Sitte called the street facades or the square facades, which wrap around a public space and which should be designed well. So axial space gives us roads, convex space gives us squares, and isovists basically give us view patterns and therefore also the possibility of moving through spaces. So this is basically three isovists in spaces, and you see here what basically we perceive when we are moving through spaces and looking at spaces, again, as embodied, bipedal, symmetrical, embodied minds turning around, for example, on Portland Square on the right, and looking at the city surrounding us. So summarizing, Hillier presents a theory of urban emergence founded upon two ideas. First, that circulation in a city is determined by the configuration of lines into a global hierarchy of depth, which he calls integration. Second, that the activities in the city adapt to take maximum advantage of this movement, a phenomenon he calls a movement economy. And most importantly, this is not just a theory, but his algorithms are empirically verified, hence evidence-based, right? They're based on evidence. And this is a powerful idea both for you as architects as well as for you as urbanists, because it gives you a way of thinking of cities really as these social engines or space machines or fusion reactors, where you can predict in some ways both intuitively and now also algorithmically, evidence-based in some ways, which spaces work and which spaces might be not well integrated enough. We use these tools kind of regularly in our urban designs. I want to show you a case study where we did that. And in this case study, we will move to Ljubljana in Slovenia, an Eastern European country. You see here the city center on the bottom left, and the perimeter which we were working on in 2008 in the center. It's an area of around 230 hectares. You see in the city center, I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse, but you see here the Castle Hill and the medieval city, respectively the Roman and later Venetian city at the very core. You see on the left-hand side Tivoli Park, a design by José Plečnik, one of the famous architects of the city. And you see here also the inner city ring designed by Fabiani, who built up the Ljubljana inner city after the big earthquake in 1895. The inner city is actually immensely beautiful. You see here also in the very center the so-called three bridges, also designed by Plečnik. And you see here the street pattern and its organization, with medieval roads, with the street pattern of the Gründerzeit, and all, of course, functioning in a highly integrated way, where you as a tourist, but you also as an urban designer, of course, would feel great pleasure walking through and experiencing these roads, and immediately and instinctively you would have a feeling of safety and orientation. This is a completely different site, the site we were working on, BTC, on the outside of the city, inside the second ring, which was a highway ring built with European money after Slovenia joined the European Union. And BTC basically became a success story of this new economy where consumer culture and car culture found a way of coming from the motor highway ring and driving in here, finding huge amounts of shopping opportunities, spaces, parking lots which were easy to use, and then the people were then moving with their shopping goods, were then moving out again via the motor highway ring, going through the emerging suburbs in which an increasing amount of people were living. So this is a success story of the car age and the commercial culture. We studied this city in great detail with the Belache Institute, writing a kind of a research report called Light Capital, Urban Scripts for Ljubljana. Ljubljana, of course, is specific in a sense that it's actually a fairly isolated city, so there's a functional region in the center of Slovenia where only two other functional urban regions are visible, so Maribor and Koper. There is a lack of connection to Croatia and Austria or Italy in terms of a continuous urban pattern. So Ljubljana needs to kind of function on its own. And in the time when we came there in 2005, for some reason this city really didn't work. There were a lot of brownfield sites here in violet, analyzed by Janez Koželj, who later became the vice mayor of the city. And the dream of Ljubljana and Slovenia in general was kind of that with joining the EU, of course, now the big money should come. all of these sites should be developed and prosperity should rise, almost kind of as a no-brainer, but that didn't work. And we tried to figure out why it didn't work as a first step. What you have here in the center of the graph is also the center of the city, where you had high rents. At the same time, you had a lack of building land, and in general, a kind of a frozen development, so nothing functioned. So no money came in, nobody tried to do anything. And we analyzed the reason for the lack of development basically by 4 important points. On the one hand, joining Europe generated very high expectations, and therefore everybody was waiting for better investment opportunities, and overall a new identity therefore kind of didn't develop. The independence from Yugoslavia also generated a transition economy, similar to the transition economies in a lot of Eastern European companies, which led to a denationalization, therefore an unclear land ownership and a lack of trust, and a trend to micro businesses, so a trend to decentralization, and therefore also due to the denationalization and transition, also a lack of public land, so the city could not help to unlock the development in the center. Because Ljubljana had a past as a provincial capital, it also had a lack of governmental infrastructure, because Ljubljana was resisting investments from Belgrade for a kind of a long time. Therefore, you also had a lack of regional public transport. And because it is a small country and not part of a larger functional region, you had a lack of critical mass. Therefore, it was not so interesting for foreign investors, and also there, a new urban identity didn't develop. So the city center turned out to be not attractive, and tourists were mainly visiting the periphery, while at the same time, because of suburbanization and sprawl, BTC and the ring developments were very, very attractive. Right? So somehow the spatial development of the city did not function, even though there was actually a kind of a nice medieval and Gründerzeit, so Art Deco, Art Nouveau, kind of Gründerzeit area in the center, and actually a not so nice urban area at the periphery, which however was of course functioning in terms of talking to people in the suburbs, being attractive for a decentralized economy, being attractive for a car-based infrastructure, and in general a commercial culture. So here we have suburban growth. Everybody tried to build his new European dream in the outskirts. People invested into micro businesses, and of course commercial culture and car culture fused together into this area in BTC. Something many of you will recognize when you live in Eastern European cities, or even in Russia. Of course you have developments like this in any city in the world, basically speaking. So here we have these two worlds. We have the BTC flourishing after 2000, after 2001, after joining the EU, and we have a beautiful city center, however, where development and investment didn't work. Our task now in 2008, winning this international urban design competition, basically was to turn this situation into that situation, so allowing for a lot more investment. But this investment would have been unthinkable only based on cars, because the streets would not be able to cope with all the new traffic which we are generating. And of course, this investment only in BTC without a link to the city would be even more detrimental to the city center, taking away development opportunities of the city rather than aiding it. Therefore, an integration of the city as a whole was a very important goal of ours, and very much therefore also a spatial and network integration. So what you see here is a space syntax map with a depth radius, so an observation radius, so to speak, which is on a citywide scale. So here we don't worry about somebody spending too much energy because, of course, because we are looking at people, for example, sitting in a car. We are people who can travel very, very easily. So here our algorithm looks at the city topology with a depth of more than 2 kilometers. We don't care how much energy we spend. And what we see here with this radius of observation is the big radial roads, right? The old radial roads. And we also see here very clearly the motor highway ring, right? So we see here this city seen from a car perspective, of course without looking at traffic jams in the city center. And from a car perspective, the motor highway ring gives you best access to everything, also of course to the BTC area, which is here. However, if we now look at the citywide scale, with the new network, we see here that we can strengthen new axes if we do it carefully, which link in a new way also on a large citywide scale back to the center. The other view is the local scale. So here we are looking at a depth radius of around 500 meters. So this is a pedestrian perspective. Here we care about that people need to find integrated patterns on a local scale. And what we see here is the old cores. We see here Ljubljana as a polycentric city, right? We see here the old medieval core. We see here how well integrated on a local scale these streets are, specifically around the very center. And we see also the incredible intelligence of Plečnik with his 3 bridges, intuitively thinking already in terms of space syntax. And we see here former peripheral village cores and how they still kind of provide a certain density. We also see here BTC, of course, not having a pedestrian road pattern with a pedestrian integration, right? We see here that you have to take a car to go to PTC, because both coming from the center to the area and walking around in the area is just incredibly unattractive, right? It's attractive for the car, but unattractive for people. And what we then do with our new network, carefully integrated both locally as well as citywide, is to change that, to really make BTC part of the city. So we are defining a new subcenter in BTC, taking this subcenter and moving it closer to the city, point number 1. And we're making here a new stepping stone into the area where again we have the road density and the choice density of a well and well circulated and kind of porous city fabric. Or here more precisely, you see here the old center, you see here BTC in the old kind of tiny centrality which we had. And here with walking distances, we have the city center. We make here a new well-integrated stepping stone, and then here a new center in BTC. So the idea is that you walk from BTC, then here it gets a bit boring, but you keep walking because it's close enough. And here it's interesting again, there is density and frequency, so like you say, interesting, you then continue walking. Again, it gets a bit boring, but then again, you have a dense street pattern. The same is true also, of course, for urban block size. So here we have the large industrial block size of BTC, which formerly was a customs-free storage area in Yugoslavian times. And we have here the block sizes of a city which is much better integrated. And the core urbanistic tool we do this with is what we call the armature, an armature which brings us from a new Kolinska park to a new square, to a boulevard which we are making, to a new park which we are proposing, to a boulevard, and then here we make a link where we need to cut through private land to a new plaza which we are proposing, an esplanade, and so on and so on. And the idea is, with this, of course, we change the perception of BTC from a car-based mental map of the customers to an urban-based mental map, where you could imagine that you not only come by car, but also by streetcar, by tram, for example, by bus, or of course very much also by bike. And this is important because what we see here is the traffic density which we are predicting based on the new functions which we are putting in the area. And we see on the left-hand side how way too much traffic, car-based traffic, which would be generated by a linear network only with this main artery here, Smartinska Street. Right, so this is the amount of car lanes which we would need in order to solve the problem which we are generating ourselves with this urban development. And here, if we are adding a clever tram system, by the way, which also does not, so with this tram line, does not cross this complicated node here. And it's a tram system and a bus system, a public transport system in general, which is a network, not only an individual line. With that, we can substantially reduce the demand on this main artery and can actually work with the existing street profile which we have without expropriating neighbors and landowners next to the street, because of this, of course, this street would need to be gigantic. In this way, in a well-integrated road network and public transport network, we can deal with it. Right, so there are two messages. On the one hand, the value of a street network which is not only based on axial lines, but is based on a more network-based kind of thing, point number one. Point number two is the importance of public transport to link to these new urban and well-integrated nodes which we are making. This then is the bird's eye view. So again, you see here this sequence of spaces which we're generating, a park, an entrance line, a square, here this kind of perimeter block urbanism which we take from the city center and pull it out to here. This is an existing workers' housing. Then we have here an important point where our main road then bifurcates and links here into a kind of a really nice portion of walking with a new park. We link here into the central square, cutting through private land here, and are then able to generate the opportunities the landlords and investors wanted from us. Or in a bit more detail, it could look like this. And again, these are fairly early renderings which give you an impression of this new link from BTC along the park to the old center of the city. Now, there's a second important issue I want to talk about. We already learned that there is a difference between an integration depth for cars, where energy and distance is not such a big deal, right? Where you see the long country roads and you see motor highways appearing in red. A difference to people who are walking, and again, people get tired. And therefore, road networks which are based on pedestrian systems need to be looked at with a shorter radius, so a kind of a smaller depth. And you can look at that even a bit more abstractly, in a sense that for some reason people tend to spend around 1 hour per day on transport in general, because after 1 hour they don't feel like it anymore, right? So they tend to spend half an hour in one direction, half an hour in another direction. So you are willing to walk to a place of work for half an hour in one direction and for half an hour in the other direction. I mean, statistically speaking, right? That also means if we now start developing transport technologies which are more powerful, then of course the distance we can travel in this 1 hour changes. And what is interesting is that cities throughout history tend to have a radius of around 30 minutes. Whether this is a pedestrian-based city of the Middle Ages up to around 1815, whether this is the city of the Gründerzeit with the horse tramways and buses, whether it's the cities of the 1900s with electric trams, or the cities of the subways, or the cities of the cars. Cities tend to have a diameter of around 1 hour, respectively a radius of around 30 minutes. And when you look at, for example, old Greek villages, they always have a certain size. They tend not to grow beyond a certain size. So cities in all cultures and throughout history tend to be 1 hour in diameter, irrespective whether this hour is spent on foot, by carriage, by tram, by metro train, or high-speed train even. This 1 hour diameter is based on a consistent human daily time budget which can be found in data from different cultures and times, and in turn seems to be defined by human physiology. You get tired, you get hungry, you get bored, right? And that means with increasing speed of the mode of transport, the potential size of the city, its catchment area, so to speak, or its commuter footprint grows. Therefore, infrastructure defines urban form, or form follows infrastructure. It also means that roads induce traffic. As soon as people move more freely, for example, with a really well-built new car road, then in cities which are attractive at least, these roads inevitably tend to be full of traffic because people just consume more transport, right? They don't just move more easily, they consume more transport, and that also means roads in attractive cities inevitably have traffic jams. You can build bigger and bigger and bigger roads, it just means that people travel more. I can show you this in a bit more detail in a second. What you see here in this globe is basically a next case study I quickly want to show you. This is work which we have done for Volkswagen over many years, from 2005 to 2018, having to do with studying phenomena of mobility. specifically of car mobility, of course, but what we were trying to show is that the car as a product is actually a really great invention, so to speak, with a lot of opportunities, but that automobility as a system increasingly reached already, we all know that, systemic limits. Can you see this star sky, so to speak? Can you nod, Katerina?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So this is a kind of an interactive research tool, so to speak, which we did to show people phenomena of mobility over 8 topics, from mobile space to fuel, from market to masses to risks, etc. And what I want to show you quickly here in English is this issue of reachability. So you have here, the efficiency of transport by car compared to other means of transport. So you sort of see in terms of energy spent, right? So you see here that a car with only one driver is even less efficient than you swimming, right? Trains are in the middle somehow, and the most energy efficient on the very right here is basically you on a bicycle. But what, and then with this globe here, we looked at different parameters, for example here, road density in particular nations, and you see, for example here, how the car nation of Germany is of course also one of the nations with the highest density of roads globally, only beaten by very tiny city-states like Bahrain or Singapore. Right, so this is really the origin of the car, very evidently, is in Germany. But more importantly, what I want to show you is this series of graphics here. You see here the same thing I said before. You see here the statement form follows infrastructure, very much visualized in terms of urban density. So what you have here is a set of cities from Hong Kong to Phoenix. The people represent 1 million people. Each individual figure, graphic figure here, represents 1 million people. So Singapore has around 3 million people. And you see with the coloring the urban density, so people per hectare. You see Hong Kong both has a lot of people and is very dense. Phoenix, on the other hand, has not so many people in the metropolitan region and is not dense, right? It has 2 million people with a very low density and a huge urban area it consumes. And obviously, the work commute, here again, this time constant which we discussed earlier, is very similar. So people tend to commute around 1 hour. In Hong Kong and Seoul, it's a bit larger because these cities have such a high pull power, so to speak. But in general, people tend to commute around 1 hour per day, but they do this very differently. In Hong Kong, they use public transport, so here the kilometers per year per person with public transport in Hong Kong is a lot higher than in Phoenix. Inversely, you have the percentage share of public transport, of course, is skewed towards public transport inversely proportional to the density. So the lower the density, the more car-based is the system. The higher the density, the more transit-based is the system. This also means that people in low-density urban areas, of course, own a lot more cars. In Hong Kong, a car is almost prohibitively complicated to own. And the important argument here is not that the people in Phoenix need a car in order to inhabit the city, so therefore they own a lot of cars. The argument is actually the other way around. Phoenix is a city which has been urbanized and specifically suburbanized by a transport system which is car-based and therefore was able to be low density. Hong Kong is very much a city which had to be urbanized by train for historic reasons and space reasons, but Seoul and London, of course, are cities which have historically been urbanized very much by train systems, or in London very much with a mix of system, and therefore have developed in a denser manner, right? Form follows infrastructure. Car-based urbanization, suburbanization generates low-density urban areas. Train-based urbanization generates high-density urban environments. And the issue right now, of course, is that when you sum up all of the money spent on transport, so you take the road system, the rail system, the cars people having to buy, and the fuel they have to buy, and you add all of this up, then transport in low-density urban areas is consuming a higher percentage of the gross domestic, of the gross regional product than in high-density urban areas, right? So it is simply more expensive to run a low-density city than it is to run a high-density city. And as transport is not something you can export, but it is simply cost of doing business in a city, this, of course, means that low-density cities are less competitive than high-density cities because they spend more of what they produce on a product which they cannot export. They spend it on pure internal friction and inefficiency. So this as a quick view into this project which we did for Volkswagen. And it basically shows you that there are different urban models which basically have to do both with history and the time of urbanization and suburbanization, so the historic period of urbanization and suburbanization, but it also has very much to do with infrastructural choices. And you see here, when you look at density of inhabitants per hectare, so from 0 to 300 people per hectare on the x-axis, versus fuel consumption in gigajoule per year, then you on the y-axis, then you see here low-density cities with a high consumption of energy, or an American urban model, and you see high-density cities with low fuel consumption, or the Asian urban model, right? And in between, you have the Australian model and the European model, and the European model is, of course, less extreme than the Asian model, because the European model is a mix of public transport cores with a ring of sprawl around them. You can look at that even more precisely and make a cluster analysis of city types, and which we did also for Volkswagen together with Jeffrey Kenworthy. And you see then that there are different types of cities. You have hybrid cities, so cities which have, again, the European cities, so to speak, which have public transport and car-based components, like Paris, London, New York, or also Los Angeles, as we will see later, or actually have seen last time with the streetcars which were decommissioned. We have clearly car-based cities like Phoenix, Houston, or Riyadh. We have transit cities, so train-based cities like Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong or Singapore. But we have also non-motorized cities like Mumbai, which are just, you know, a series of villages compressed together into an urban area which has very little urban infrastructure, for example Mumbai. You have paratransit cities, so cities which have tuk-tuks or other small individual transport systems, which however are not individually owned, like Dhaka or Johannesburg. And you have traffic-saturated cities which basically don't function well, like Bangkok, Cairo, Tehran or Jakarta, because they cannot deal anymore with the induced car traffic going into their city. And when you look at, for example, this transit city, then you see here a graph you have already seen. You see Tokyo and how it has been developing very much along these railroad lines which were privately invested in, for example, by these department store companies or railroad companies which built department stores at the city center, an amusement park on the other end of the line, and developed the city along their lines, which we will see a little piece of later again. So this is one way of urban development. Again, form follows infrastructure. But at the same time, of course, this is also then paralleled with the development of technology, for example here, car technology, which is of course also something which acts on our cities, and which is of course attractive. So what you have here on the very left is the origin of the cars and the motorbike, you know, very simple. And then from 1900 to around 1950, a kind of a functional differentiation where you had different car types. And then from 1945 or 1950s onward, a kind of a consumer-based or market-based differentiation where ever more precisely targeted car models were produced to excite and turn into purchasers ever more narrowly defined consumer segments. And what is interesting is, of course, that now urban mobility is really changing extremely rapidly. It is, of course, also changing very much away from the car-based and suburbia-driven sprawling cities into cities which are more mobility chain-based. And you see here how these technologies change increasingly rapidly. So from the metro system, which was adapted over time, so a number of cities which have a metro system, to car sharing, to bike sharing, and to Google Transit apps, right? You see that in mobility transformation, a lot is happening currently. Now, this gives us a sort of an idea of how cities developed. Again, space syntax shows us how city patterns develop. We have seen how city patterns are also linked to infrastructure, and infrastructure is linked to the daily transport budget of people, so that more powerful infrastructures generate bigger cities, and more decentralized infrastructures, for example, a car-based infrastructure generates sprawling cities, and a more transit-based infrastructure generates dense cities organized as a pearl chain of train stations with high-density developments around them. And we saw how that links also to the development of technologies of transport, and how these changes are speeding up currently in this rapid urbanization we are in. Now we go to the next scale. We go to the scale beyond cities for a moment. Because of course, cities are linked to other cities again by pieces of infrastructure. Here you see an ancient Roman road in Syria. You really have to imagine that that is what these roads looked like in general. And I want to show you the work quickly of Joe Gouldy, a historian currently working in the States, who wrote a really interesting book called Roads to Power, or How Britain Invents the Infrastructure State. She writes how Britain built the first nation connected by infrastructure, and how that went hand in hand with the libertarian revolution, destroying a national economy, and how technology caused strangers to stop speaking together in villages. So you have to imagine that before this infrastructure revolution, roads were much rather routes, ways people traveled along a valley, for example, or along a river, or across a pass. And these routes were not perfectly made, right? These routes were growing over time, changing over time. And they were organized on the left in these mental maps, which were simply linking one village to the next one in a way which people just followed because it was customary to do so. On the right-hand side, you have a very different map. You have a map with precise roads. You have a map done by a state which knows how to draw maps. So something has changed here. And Gouldy describes it like this, that transport and the state had not always belonged together. In the ancient world, the paved roads of government were an anomaly in a landscape traversed by footpaths. The earliest long-distance trade routes extended across the borders of one of the earliest economic divides, that of the Eurasian steppes, where pastoral nomads traded with farmers in the valleys below. By the first millennium before Christ, these sporadic trade networks flowed into the Silk Roads that stretched from China to the Mediterranean. Right? It was informally organized, but of course used by many people. In the following centuries, the paths of silk traders shifted with the tides of trade and the threat of war. They connected with caravans of camels coming out of Africa and sea routes charted by skilled navigators of the Indian Oceans. Over these routes were carried stories, religions, diseases, and political systems. It was the route, not the road, that carried commerce and religion. And you have to imagine that these early cities, which we have seen last time, were very much linked by routes, so by informal path systems. Now, roads were something else. Roads were a mechanism for government and a tool for the travels of soldiers, but very rarely an artery for trade. The ancient roads of Persia and Rome connected only destinations useful to administrators. They carried soldiers and judges, but rarely ox carts or pack horses. The military roads built by Henry IV in England or Louis XIV in France carried soldiers across isolated peaks, but it too had little impact on the course of trade. That division, so the government road and the merchant route, collapsed beneath the infrastructure revolution. In the 17th century, city-states began organizing their collective wealth around the provision of canals. The first government built corridors for carrying commodities rather than soldiers. And by the 19th century, infrastructure had taken the form of state-designed sewers and slum clearance projects, tools of social as well as civil engineering. So what you see here is basically roads which were built by the engineers of the military, paid for by the bureaucrats of a centrally organized city-state, so to speak, around London, claiming increasingly aggressively its hinterland first local, then up all the way to Scotland. And now not only for military uses like we have seen in Rome and the Roman very colonial system, but also for markets, specifically for urban markets, right? Because these cities started to control not only the space within the city walls, but increasingly with better and better technologies, so road building technologies, but also organizational tools like the military, or tools like money and bureaucracy. They started to extend urban markets into the countryside. So road building was the combination of military technological knowledge with administrative expertise and funding. It led to a new form of state, the infrastructure state, and a new idea of statehood and politics. So it meant that urban markets left the city, claimed the countryside. That, by the way, together with increasingly well-organized carriage, so horse carriage traffic, with the introduction of the clock, which allowed you to measure time in predictable ways over a larger territory. This integrated market basically then reached and started to define national boundaries, right, where the influence of the city, so to speak, was stopped by the influence of other cities. And you could argue that the territorially integrated nation state which we know today is very much a consequence of this infrastructure state which Joe Gouldy describes. And in some ways, when China talks about this Road and Belt Initiative, they do this in a very contemporary, and of course very ambitious manner. Now, these trade routes, of course, increasingly perfected, increasingly administered by bureaucracy, by synchronized time, by the establishment of time zones, for example, by territorial integration, of course, pulled cities in its wake. Cities stepped over the city walls because the territory became integrated, it became safe, it became protected by an increasingly mobile military traveling along these routes, and by an increasingly integrated market enabled by this network. So when cities expanding their commuter footprint along already existing trade routes and roads and connections, they start to grow together to larger urban regions. Cities leaving their city walls were connecting together in increasing ways. And what this means, to understand what this means, we need to quickly talk about Johann Heinrich von Thünen. He conceptualized a city as this kind of onion shape of centrality, of density, of economy, and therefore also of cost. And he argued that based on this cost difference from the center to the periphery, there are also different productive activities developing with different economic backgrounds and a decreasing dependency on centrality with decreasing distance from the center. So in the center you have the city with trade and so on, then you have dairy farming, you have wheat, you have grazing, and at the very edge you have waste. This is how he conceptualized the economy of a city, simply based on proximity to the center, independent of routes and roads. Walter Christaller in the 1930s took then this idea and expanded it and said, well, cities are linking to other cities through these routes and roads which we are now discussing, and generate a hierarchy of cities, of important cities with big marketplaces to less important cities, and so on and so on and so on, in a network of cities which we can see also in space, for example here, almost in a perfect way straddling a countryside. Of course, very much following network law. So a link between two cities is not so interesting. As soon as you link more cities together, you have network effects, making this system become more and more powerful. Remember when we were talking in the first lecture about scaling effects, where we have super exponential growth? The argument here is that this growth does not happen only inside cities, it also happens between cities, where it is beneficial for cities to link up into larger city systems, and that again makes them generate more surplus, which then allows them again to link to more cities. And what we have seen before is the infrastructural networks which allows them to do that. A person who conceptualized this linking up of cities into city systems is Denis Puma of the University of Paris, who is also one of the important complexity scientists looking at city systems, doing this very much from an urbanistic point of view, arguing that, on the one hand, cities have particular histories, which we tell each other as historic narratives, but they also have common dynamics. So they tend to link up and generate opportunities and surplus and life in the city system which Bill Hillier has shown us. These individual nodes described, for example, by von Thünen, link up into the networks of cities described by Christaller. And that then gives these cities additional growth opportunities, and that then generates the common dynamics which Denis Puma is describing, from a micro scale to the city scale to the urban networks on the macro scale. But it's always the same thing. This fusion reactor which we have seen in Oxford Street at the very beginning, territorialized by increasingly powerful infrastructures, also starts to function on larger scales, where these larger scales and the lower scales, of course, start then to interact in many different kinds of ways, ending up with this super exponential growth which we have seen in the first lecture. So she says scaling refers to a set of properties associated to a type of complex systems which exhibit nonlinear relations, often formalized as power law. Power law means exponential power laws, or the super exponential growth which we have seen with Didier Sonnet, among attributes of their subsystems, either in their spatial organization or during their temporal development. So what I'm trying to show you is, you could say that space is the machine with Billy Hillier, not only for Oxford Street, but also for this city system which Denis Puma is studying. Or when you talk about with Betancourt, asking, do social organizations also display universal power law scaling for variables reflecting key structural and dynamical characteristics? In what sense, if any, are small, medium, and large cities scaled versions of one another, thereby implying that they are manifestations of the same average idealized city? And again, in the course of these lectures, we have seen elements of this idealized city, and here in this slide by Dömis Böhmer, both for Europe and for India, we see how these increasingly powerful technologies inside cities and those linking cities generate this urban growth of the last century. And this urban growth, of course, is something incredibly tangible. Again, we are in the lecture space. So something happens in space when these cities grow. For example, turning the Pearl River Delta in 1979 to the Pearl River Delta of today, respectively, in 2003. This is what happens when technology and urbanization is applied to territory. And of course, these cities have power, economic power. They control hinterlands and markets and generate densities. For example, here, looking at the Pearl River Delta. And in a system like that, you also have synergies between different kinds of cities who have different kinds of specializations, conceptualized, for example, here by Rem Koolhaas with his term cities of exacerbated difference. So in the Pearl River Delta, you not only have a city network, you also have a city network of cities which complement each other with their capabilities and talents, turning them into an even more powerful urban system. So he says that the Pearl River Delta is not a single city, but a region inhabited by a cluster of very diverse cities such as Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Guangdong, Zhuhai, and Macau. Together, they may represent a new model of the megalopolis in the sense that their coexistence, their functioning, their legitimacy is determined by their extreme mutual difference. So as usual, with Rem Koolhaas, take away the boasting claim of newness. We know that similar things already happened in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, right? But his argument still is valid that these cities cooperate in a way, as we have seen also in the medieval times, shown very well by Brodel, showing, for example, the links between Bruges, Amsterdam, and so on and so on. This is a graphic by us. It shows you how this Pearl River Delta city is an unbelievably powerful production house globally, where you see this immense amount of products being exported into the entire world, and of course then fueled, of course, by millions of migrant workers at the top, many of them undocumented, coming into this urban system and generating that inviolable economic output. Whether this is good or bad, I leave to your judgment. And you see then also, of course, foreign direct investments, the white arrows flowing back into this system. And this you have several times over the globe now, these city systems growing together into large urban regions. We have seen this already last time, always with core cities, and these then of course being the economic powerhouses of the world. Now let's look at this link between territory and urban networks a bit more precisely in the case study of which I know well, which is Switzerland. And Switzerland, as we have seen last time, is interesting because it is sitting at the cross of the Alpine Rim, here in white, so topographically differentiated area at the center of Europe. But it's also, it's the cross also, however, of the European urban system with northern Italy at the bottom and Germany up to, all the way up to London, and the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany, of course, at top. So it is at the cross-section between the topographical differentiation of the Alpine Rim and the topological intensity of the urban system of Europe, east-west versus north-south. And Switzerland, of course, topographically is this landscape of hills. In 1315, when the Swiss Federation was just starting up, only in the core the early Swiss were able to control this area. Other than that, they were very much under the influence of the Habsburgians. And in the Middle Ages, these road networks, of course, were very tangible, again spanning from Italy all the way to Germany via the mountain passes across the lakes and then going into the River Rhine here. And the early Swiss Federation you need to imagine as a pact between those areas which controlled the urban, which controlled the routes between the urban system of Italy and Germany via their passes, so they controlled the routes, the center, and those cities which controlled the nodes, the early city-states of Zurich, Basel, at that time also Mulhouse. And this pact between the routes and the nodes of this system is, of course, very much urban already from the very beginning. And over time, these nodes, so here this walled medieval city of Zurich, where the urban system, the urban regime on inside of the wall was very different from the countryside, from the rural regime outside of the walls, which often was subservient to the city. You know, they were provinces of the city. And this early system of urban city-states and countryside, which was basically subservient to the cities, so property of the cities, had then to be freed by Napoleon, you know, which we have seen last time with his more egalitarian French ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité. That then basically cracked open this city-state system, and in the Viennese Congress, Switzerland then got the boundaries it has today, and became then the modern nation which we know now. What you have to know is that until the 1850s, Switzerland was a poor country exporting mercenaries and settlers. Here you see poor people from Switzerland on Ellis Island trying to find a new life on the new continent. But in the 1900s, industrialization happened, and this territorially integrated infrastructure state, freed by Napoleon, given a boundary by the Viennese Congress, became really linked up and territorialized, first privately with all of these private railroad projects, and then increasingly also with the nation state which we know today. Railroad links which traveled the hills and were accompanied, of course, by an electrification of the country with these infrastructure projects of the 1900s. And that turned a city of walls, which still needed to be protected from a countryside which was not always safe, and had an urban market and an urban culture very different from the surrounding landscape, to a city which jumped over the walls, eradicating the walls in an increasingly territorially integrated and safe national environment, powered by increasingly powerful transport infrastructures. The same thing happened in Vienna with the ring wall, etc. To the city we know, to the nation which we know today. And this nation, where you still see its origins with the very many small municipalities, now of course integrated into large functional urban regions. This we want to now look at a bit more precisely as a current moment. So these are the large functional urban regions in Zurich. So you have in Switzerland. So you have the region of Zurich, you have Basel, you have Bern, you have the Arc Lémanique with Geneva and Lausanne, and in the south you have Lugano, tied together by infrastructure, now of course integrated and very performative. In red, railroad, in orange, the street system. And in many ways, these functional regions are a kind of are economic powerhouses, all of them differentiated. And the rest of the country is a kind of an alpine park, where, however, again, with these cities you might know, like St. Moritz, you have kind of global resorts, which of course, again, in their own way, are highly urbanized. When we now dive into one of these functional urban regions, into the metropolitan region of Zurich, then you see here again the medieval city in the center and the functional region very much infrastructuralized and urbanized beyond the boundaries of today, which represents a commuter footprint, which is of course a dynamic entity. Commuter footprint means that every magenta, so dark magenta part in the middle, means that more than 12.5% of people travel to Zurich for their jobs. And the more infrastructure you build, the bigger this dynamic region grows. Form follows infrastructure again. And this region again is of course in contact with other regions, both nationally as well as internationally. And you can define this region in different ways, but very much here as a commuter region. And we conceptualized this region as a kind of a mosaic of location, where you have urban parts here with the bright colors, you have green elements in these green colors, and we argue that this is very much functioning almost like an ecology, but an ecology, very importantly, where different types of scales are acting onto each other. Also the same way you have it here, right? Water has a larger scale than this little stone with moss on it, because nutrients, animals and so on move more freely in this open area than they move here. And you have also different opportunities in this differentiated environment, opportunities for open areas, for high trees on solid ground, etc., etc. And in many ways, this differentiated location mosaic, this functional urban region around Zurich, is also differentiated in these almost ecological ways as this image here, with the different scales acting on each other. And these scales are, on the left, the scale of infrastructure, which integrates this footprint in a technical way and also in terms of time. Again, remember this transport time budget which we have seen of 1 hour. So people can work in the center because all of these outlying cities here are linked to Zurich in and about a half an hour radius, right? So that's the realm of infrastructure, or as we call it, structure in general. Then we have the realm of these individual neighborhoods, or as we call it, the Gestalt, and we have the realm of form, what architects normally misunderstand as urbanism and urban design, because form, of course, is only one component of this complex system we're looking at. So the structure is organized by railroad and by cars, and this structure binds all of these old Alemannic settlements in the topography, in this differentiated topography of the Alpine Rim, together into this polycentric urban region of Zurich, with Zurich very much as the core. This topography in itself generates location factors and movement vectors, as we have seen in these old medieval routes, for example, using the Lake of Zurich and the Vierwaldstätter See as part of their route systems, and the passes as links between valley chambers. But these routes also, of course, then link this structure of the metro region of Zurich to the larger scale, to Europe, with Stuttgart and Munich, to Basel and Bern, or here over the Gotthard to Italy. Now, when we look more into the city, then you have the same thing again. You don't need to understand this in detail. This is a work we are right now doing for the traffic system of Zurich, where we have the tram network, the catchment area of the tram network with 5 minutes on foot in dark blue and 5 minutes on bike in light blue, and we have urban density with these dots, and we have growth potential, which we now need to align with this traffic system in red. Right, so the same system or the same thinking of infrastructure and catchment areas generating urban potential you have on the large scale, on the very large scale, but also on the scale of an individual tram line. It's always the same story. If we then go to the Gestalt layer, so this layer which is organized around these original village settlements, on the one hand in parts still being isolated villages, for example here, on the other hand these villages growing together into cities with neighborhoods and quarters, then you see here the original settlement structure. You see here reserves of buildable area and traffic demand, public transport in magenta, private transport in blue. You see that the accessibility potential of the private transport, so of cars, when you look from the city and you move out, gives you kind of an equal spread of access. The public transport system, however, gives you these dots, so it shows you that Zurich is suburbanized very much by the train system. So it's more efficient for me living here, for example, when moving to the city, to take the train, right? The accessibility potential of these blue nodes is much higher vis-a-vis the train, vis-a-vis the city center. And therefore, based on this powerful train infrastructure, we have a polycentric urban development, not a sprawling development like you have seen earlier with Phoenix and so on. There's also airport noise. And interestingly enough, a political pattern also emerges, where in the city center you have left-leaning voters, around that you have liberal-leaning voters, and in black you have conservative-leaning voters in the countryside. This, by the way, is a pattern you see all over the world. It's always the same. And I will talk about that a tiny bit at the end of the lecture. All of these factors together gives us a capacity for change. So the more magenta an area is, the easier it can change itself, the more dynamic it is. The bluer, the less dynamic you have in this particular area. And the grayscale, so it means that the darker a particular area is, the less potential for change it has in terms of its identity. So for example here, this part of Zurich is its historic core. So even so it is well accessible, you cannot put high rises there because you cannot change the identity so easily. And finally, you have the scale of form. So what we see as people standing in a street, for example, or looking at a building, or being in a park. And all of that together, so the deep level of the structure, the experiential level of the Gestalt with all of its opportunities to change, its dynamic, something we experience as potential, as life, and the final layer of form, which we read as embodied minds with our bodies, our movements, and our eyes and senses. All of that put together gives you this differentiated territory or this location mosaic, which makes Zurich attractive and viable because it's a good mix of potential and identity, of green and urban substance. And zooming in, you see the integration of these different kinds of skills together. And this again then gives you, as we have seen in the Pearl River Delta, these local areas, each of which has again its unique talents, reinforcing each other and cooperating with each other, but also competing with each other in this cooperative system and with its different location profiles. Now, just as a quick aside, something we will look at more later in the next lecture, but of course, this also has an economic component, meaning central locations which are attractive are expensive. So what you see here is the rental cost for a 4-room apartment in 2016, and you see very exactly that these urbanized cores, so for example here Zurich, Lausanne, Geneva, a bit also Basel, you see how exactly the synchronization of all of these opportunities through structure, through Gestalt, and through form gives you, of course, an immense economic divergence. And attractive centers tend to grow, and not so attractive older areas tend to shrink. Countrysides, but also rural towns which are not anymore connected so well to this urban this global urban system. What you see here is a map of Europe where you see this difference in growth and potential playing itself out over an entire continent. So red areas are growing, blue areas are shrinking, and you see how urban opportunities are very much organized around attractive cores of cities which are linked well together, and you see that cities which are not, or towns which are not in this link, or even countrysides, are shrinking and depopulating. And this hurts. This is painful and makes people angry. And this anger, you see itself playing out in the electoral map of the United States as we speak. In blue here, you have the big urban centers supporting Biden, supporting inclusion, globalization, markets, a liberal view of the world. And in red, in those towns which are not profiting from this planetary urbanization, which feel left out, which lack opportunities, lack education, and lack a narrative for the future, they are revolting against this urban elite here in red. And you see that in some areas, despite all the problems Trump has generated in the last 4 years, people still were leaning more towards him, so the red arrows leaning to the right, rather than less the red arrow, the blue arrows leaning to the left towards Biden. Right? You see the consequence of this spatial system playing itself out in the daily lives and therefore in the voting pattern of people. So this highly connected space and territory which we generated over the last 10,000 years, seen here as a snapshot in space rather than a story in time, has opportunities and dark sides, which we are now discussing in politics, as we see in the election in the United States, or in the strategies of China, very consciously, of course, and very centrally controlled, keeping these links intact as much as they can. But what we can take with it altogether, and these links then are also playing themselves out between cities. So here, for example, you have Zurich and its friends, so to speak, right? Almost like a Facebook chart. And these friends, quote unquote, have to do with infrastructural connections, but also with market connections. So, for example, Zurich has a link very much east-west, so to Munich and to Chicago, to Boston, to Beijing. And Geneva, for example, has a very different linkage pattern. It has a linkage pattern which is more north-south because it has all the international institutions. So it has links to Mombasa, it has links to Paris, etc. Munich again has a different kind of linkage system. And this is data by Peter J. Taylor. You actually have seen this data already in these maps, where these links then become more easily visualized. So that the redder these cities are, the more of these types of links they have looked at this global city system coherently. And there's also another story starting, which we look at in another lecture, the story of digitalization, which in parts, of course, liberates us completely from the territory you have seen before. In other parts, however, still follows the geographical clock. You see here servers being active over time, still following daily routines. And of course, the cables which link us all together now on Zoom are still running over land or running through oceans, right? So there's still a territorial component to this digital world. But there is also part of this digital world which is completely virtualized, where all of a sudden you have kind of cloud economies which are partially still geographic, but where geography links together in entirely new and very, very flexibly organizable and addressable ways. So when you look at these Twitter maps, you see the coexistence of these two worlds. You see the old topographies, you see valley systems, you see oceans, you see country boundaries. You see the infrastructural links, and both in cities, so for example in Moscow here and in Paris. But you see also these urban systems where cities start growing together. So for example here in Switzerland, you see here Germany, you see Holland, Belgium and England. By the way, the blue dots are Twitter tweets. So very urban, and the orange dots are Flickr posts, so where you also see the beauty of the Alps represented by all of these photographs people took. And you see the same thing also in London. Again, London, as we have seen, a city which started as a medieval city, was then organized by transit, so the metro system of London, therefore has these really strong nodes, but then also has portions around London which are more sprawling. You see Los Angeles, where you see here the old streetcar pattern with moments of high density, and you see here the sprawling pattern, much more equally distributed. And here, in a very beautiful way, you see the dense moments around the Yamanote line in Tokyo, or here very nicely you see so that the railroad ring around the center of Tokyo, and here very nicely you see these railroad lines which were privately funded with their pearl chains of local densities. So even so tweets are of course part of the digital world, they are still anchored in space and allow us to see the layering of the space I tried to describe to you, from topography to topology to now the new layer of the digital. And it is interesting that people still tweet where the density of people is highest. It correlates very beautifully. And what we can take from that altogether is that even so infrastructure and the digital seems to flatten the planet, we very much still live on a planet where we have immense moments of density in these urban cores, developed over millennia, and where we now need to deal with the future-proofing, the better organization of these cores on the one hand, and in solving some of the economic, political, and in the ecological, existential problems these gigantic peaks have created. So this is the lecture, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Markus, for showing us these different layers and these different scales. And also, I really like your approach when you're showing how to work across this scale, because usually in our practice we need to switch between scales and sometimes to look more deeply in some particular scales and particular information and data to get more insights and to understand what exactly happens in the area. And also, I would like you to maybe talk a little bit more about this mathematical, let's say, prediction about space syntax, because I know that there are lots of debates around this. So there are some people who really think that it's very hard to predict the patterns. So with the space syntax, because it actually doesn't show the time. Actually you have the space, but you have no time, so you don't understand sometimes open hours and the life of the city. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that point?
It's a very good point. I mean, space syntax can only do so much. For me, space syntax has two important roles. On the one hand, we use space syntax the same way we use force flow diagrams in structure in buildings. You know, how does gravity flow through the floor slabs and columns of a building? And a good engineer can explain you that. And in this type of engineering manner, we use space syntax to predict integration, to predict whether particular spaces are integrated enough. And many times when you're aware of these issues, you have this in your blood, you kind of know it already. But space syntax is a good tool to visualize it in a way where it also becomes visible to clients and other people who maybe do not have the same professional awareness. It is also something extremely intuitive. As soon as you have explained it to people, they understand that this kind of makes sense. So it's a good tool in conversations. And since it's evidence-based, it has a certain weight. The other thing about space syntax is almost more philosophical. Again, I'm interested in understanding cities as complex systems, and the magic of cities is that it generates interactions and transactions, so it brings us together. And when people come together and are stabilized in space and time, things happen. Ideas are being generated. Trade is possible. Culture becomes thinkable. And this social system has a space in which it unfolds, and some spaces do that better than others. And space syntax allows me to imagine that almost like the resonance pattern in a musical instrument. You know, I imagine a city as a resonance pattern. And on Oxford Street, a lot of this resonance is happening, like a violin string moving. And then, of course, you know, there are things space syntax cannot do. In fact, there is no time associated to it. But there are new tools, you know, Professor Novikov, whom some of you probably know, does that with Habitatum. We do that CVD with our big data spin-off also in parts. And however, that's simply an additional tool that doesn't devalue space syntax. Is like handwriting is not being devalued by you writing on a computer. It's just a different tool with different abilities. And again, what I want to leave you with is both the concept that space brings us together. Some do it better than others, and there's an evidence-based way of analyzing this ability. And secondly, I want to leave you with this image of this resonance pattern, where we as human beings interact and transact in an organized way, and it is our role as urbanists and designers to make sure that this resonance is positive and not negative.
Thank you so much.
Other questions? I know these lectures tend to be long, and probably everybody's a bit exhausted. But also, if you have ideas or fears, or I think the interesting thing is, in many ways, when you look at urbanization in time, you have these issues of inevitabilities, right? You have these dynamics which we not yet fully understand and control. However, when you look at cities as spaces, it's something incredibly pleasurable and enabling, freeing, and inspiring, and I think this is what we should look for, the pleasure of existing in spaces. And I think therefore also as architects and urbanists, I think you need to make sure that you have very physical lives. You need to intuitively understand orientation, movement, and so on when you deal with space. And maybe this is a more hopeful ending than that of the last lecture.
I also have maybe not a question, but a kind of observation, considering the current pandemic situation. So, listening to your lecture today and thinking about all of these scales, um, I'm thinking that do you have this feeling that the way of thinking right now is changing a little bit from this variety of scales to some of them, because it seems to me that what I feel from my point of view, but however my patterns might be different from other people. But however, I feel this, that I have a neighborhood scale of thinking right now, and when I'm like when I use the city, right? And the second scale is a car scale, private car scale, because right now there is a fear that public transport is not safe enough. So, what do you think about that? And do you see similar patterns or concerns?
I mean, two answers. First of all, I mean, the pandemic brings to stark visibility the fact that cities are places where people interact. And they have always been that. The modern epidemiology basically started in London when John Snow, a statistician, looked at the outbreaks of cholera and was able, due to careful evidence-based working, to trace this outbreak back to particular wells in London, right? So he was able to see a pandemic of that time as being created in a very particular way. At that moment, still transmitted by water wells very much. And of course, the pandemic today is the same thing, with a virus, of course, which floats via the air as an aerosol, right? But it's cities have always been built around the understanding that the proximity of people is necessary for culture and economy. On the other hand, it's dangerous due to issues of disease and politics, right? So cities have been built for that since centuries. And so we shouldn't overrate the effect of the pandemic. We will be able to deal with it in many ways, right? However, what you're saying is extremely true, that it changes the perception of the city because, of course, you tend now to use more local and more private paths than before. And that brings me to the next point of resilience. A city which you have the choice of mass transport versus private transport, of the city scale versus the local scale, and in both worlds you can live a life that functions socially, economically, and so on. That is a resilient city, right? A city where all of a sudden, because you cannot travel with mass transit anymore, and you can only behave in particular ways, that is a less resilient city, because all of a sudden you lose opportunities. Your economic outlook completely changes. And the ability to choose, specifically also the ability to exist in a more local scale, this is something which we will talk about in the last 3 lectures, is something which we absolutely have to look for in the cities of the future. So I think, yes, I think the perception changes. No, I don't think this change will last forever. But yes, it is great that we are aware that this choice is necessary and contributes to resilience.
Thank you so much. So maybe someone else got any ideas or concerns? I think we are all trying to understand all of the complexity you have showed to us. So.
But I think the important thing is that it's a lot of stuff, It's a lot of information, but in the end, it's about two vectors right now. It's a vector in time, and it's a vector in space. And you just need to have an intuitive understanding of both right now. And secondly, you need to know that along both of these vectors, things are knowable if you're looking for that knowledge, right? I think that's the important message of these lectures. You cannot absorb everything I'm telling you right now, but you need to have a mental map with these vectors. A third one will come in the next lecture. And you need to know that things are knowable, and evidence-based thinking aided by good intuition and taste is doable. Right? That's the most important message of what I'm trying to get across. Because as soon as you have a mental map, and as soon as you know that things are knowable, maybe not all solvable, but they're knowable, then you're enabled, then you're free, right? Then you can make your own choices and can find your own ways. And I think that's a key ability to have in a future where maybe it's not always so easy to separate fact from fake news.